All right. I'll just preface this with saying I'm pretty friendly to philosophers and I think they have a lot to offer, but my message in the talk is mixed, right? Okay, so a good place to start is to ask, what has philosophy of mind contributed to the neuroscience of consciousness? Right, so I could go over that, or what has neuroscience contributed the other way around to philosophy. I think a better place to start is what is consciousness in the first place. And already right there, we're in trouble. And we need the help of philosophers and still do. But I'll do my best to start with a notion that I guess most of us agree on. Right. We talk about consciousness typically in neuroscience and in philosophy of mind in terms of subjective experience. So it's the private part of perception, right? The part that only you can know for yourself. What's it like for you to see the color red, for example? Giulio Tononi famously talks about it's what abandons us every night when we fall into dreamless sleep and returns the next morning when you wake up. It's our inner experience of things, like the redness of bread, the fragrant smell of a rose, the pain of an impacted wisdom tooth. That one just came to me. Philosophers use the word qualia, but the notion here is that it's the what it's like. Is that a slippery slope towards dualism? I'll speculate on that as we go. But here to hammer one more time on this point is this notion of what consciousness is and how it's treated either explicitly or implicitly by most as something else. Okay, so if I were to tell you that I had a model of you and here it is, right? Input and processing, and there can be a lot that goes on in the processing part, and it can be reflexive and so on, and then behavior. You'd say, well, no, I mean, that's an insult. That's a garage door opener, right? There's something really important missing from that, right? Which is that I don't just process information and produce output, but I have this inner experience, and that inner experience has something to do with the decisions I make and the output that I produce, right? A very common and intuition pumping example is pain, right? So from a point of view of survival, if you encounter a painful stimulus, something hot, or you prick your finger, right? What should you do? Well, you should withdraw, protect your injury, and learn something, like don't do that again, right? And maybe there are a couple other things you could think of, but I think that pretty much from a point of view of survival exhausts what we care about. And yet there is, it seems, something missing from all of that, right? Which is that it hurts. And where is that in all of this, and what's its role? Well, that's the consciousness part, and this intuition pump is designed to kind of prime you with the idea that we think of it for whatever reason as something else, right? Another great example that's often used to highlight what consciousness is blind sight. I worked with a blind sight patient many years ago who, through a car accident at the age of 8, he's had damage to his left primary visual cortex. So that leaves him blind, effectively cortically blind, to whatever's over to the right in his visual field. So whatever he's looking at, everything to the right of that, it's not there anymore visually, right? And yet we can present stimuli there that the patient denies seeing, but if we goad him into guessing, he gets them right. So the details don't matter that much. We know that there are other pathways that are preserved that mediate, it's not ESP, right? That promote that information, the processing of that information, right? But for whatever reason, those pathways don't give the patient the feeling that he's seeing something. And so you can sort of define consciousness in terms of what it's not. It's what's missing here, right? You can still do things, meaningful things in response to the stimuli, but the subjective part isn't there. Now that's an oversimplification because there are a lot of things that a blind sight patient cannot do in their blind hemisphere. They can do simple things like the orientation of a bar, the direction of motion of a dot, presence or absence, right? But I mean, they can't tell the difference between a square and a rectangle. So it's not a perfect analogy, but it's a intuition problem, right? The idea that what is missing there is consciousness. Now, to make things more complicated, we use the word in two very different ways. So I like to always point this out because it is a very important distinction. We talk about consciousness on the one hand as a state of arousal. So the dog on the left is not, the dog on the right is. But we also talk about it in terms of sensory information content, right? So the cat on the bottom left is not conscious of the mouse, right? And the one on the right is. So in that use of the word consciousness, it's always, right, followed by the word of, conscious of, right? As I see it, that's the bottom one, that's the interesting question, right? That's when we're talking about consciousness, qualia, if you want, that's what we're interested in. What goes on in the brain that promotes information that you otherwise might not have been conscious of? What promotes it to have this special status, being conscious, right? That something else is tricky to isolate. It's tricky to operationalize and isolate. Blind sight is one example where we've kind of tried to isolate it a bit, but like I said, there are a lot of things. A blind sight patient is not a visual zombie. It's not like they can do absolutely everything that you and I can do and they're just lacking the subjective part. No, right? There are a lot of other deficits that go along with it. So it doesn't isolate the subjective. Somnambulism, another example, comes close, not quite, but people who sleepwalk can do all sorts of fancy things in their sleep. And presumably they're not conscious. We can look at what areas of their brain are or not active when they're sleepwalking. And then question mark, right? Coma and disorders of consciousness. That's also been a big topic in the field. I actually think that that's orthogonal to the question of interest for reasons that I'll get to. It is important, but it's not the same as the question of qualia. Right? So when we do science, we measure things. We have to. We can talk about things that we can't measure directly, but we have to at least get to them by way of something that we can. One of the special things about consciousness is we can't measure it directly, right? You can't put an electrode in my consciousness. You can put an electrode in my brain, right? You can measure my reaction times and my responses to stimuli and things like that, right? There are lots of things you can probe and measure in various ways, but consciousness isn't one of them, whatever it is, right? And again, that kind of alludes back to this idea that we think of it as like something else, that we should be able to stick an electrode in. Damn it, why can't we? Right? So what is it after all then? So like, it can't be neural information processing, so we wouldn't need to talk about consciousness, right? Because there's a lot of neural information that isn't part of your consciousness. Grouping and segregation, for example, in perception, that's maybe necessary for consciousness, but it's certainly not sufficient. Object representation, well, that's getting there, but again, it's necessary, but probably not sufficient. And even metacognition, certain feats of metacognition seem possible without having to invoke the concept of consciousness.
Can you give me Can you give an example of that then, so I get the idea right?
Metacognition?
Of something that you don't think is sufficient to be to lead to consciousness.
Something that
You said that it's not enough.
Well, it doesn't meet the requirements of this something else.
A large language model or some AI would have these.
You can at least imagine implementing all of these things without necessarily having to invoke the concept of consciousness, right? So what I think we're after is this: it's the process by which neural information becomes subjectively experienced, right? Which is in a way orthogonal to all these other things, right? If it's anything at all, it's something like that. And you might, so some people have toyed with the idea of introspection. Well, maybe that's the way there, because that's, you know, we can directly access our own consciousness and then maybe tell others about it, right? There are a couple of problems with that. One is the one quoted here, right? Introspection is just another kind of processing. It can access the information content of consciousness, but not consciousness itself, right? But another problem is if you're going to do anything with introspection, right, then you'd better not ever tell anyone about it, right? Because as soon as you do, it becomes behavior. Right? If you don't, it's not science. So the introspection doesn't seem to get you there either, right? So after all that, is consciousness just a non-starter? Well, I don't think so. I mean, I study it. So I think there is something to explain. Maybe this just in the end will end up altering our definition of consciousness and this notion that it's something else, right? One thing, a big one, and I think it's the biggest outstanding question to explain, is the boundary in terms of neural activity between what goes on in your brain that isn't, for whatever reason, part of your consciousness and that which is. So I can ask you something as simple as to sign your own name, and you'll be conscious of me asking you, and you'll be conscious of picking up a pen and signing your name. But signing your name involves a very, very complicated and delicate coordination of lots of little tiny muscles that is carried out by your brain. But you're privy to none of it consciously. And on the sensory side, right, something as simple as recognizing a face, that is immediate for you. You look at that and you say it's a face, end of story, right? But there's a lot of complicated processing that's involved in going from that visual input to, hey, that's a face. And again, you're privy to none of it, right? So one of the biggest outstanding questions in my mind is, where's the boundary? And can we delimit it between what can at least, and sometimes does become part of our consciousness, and what isn't at a given moment, and what never is? For example, like the control of your blood vessels. So that's what I think is the question, and why there is something here that's worth studying. Why is some neural information accessible subjectively in this special way and other neural information is not? And how are these two subsets of neural information that are present in the very same brain different, right? And that suggests some sort of a contrastive approach, which is what we've been doing in the field for the last 30 years. And what some people are saying has outlived its usefulness, but I very much disagree. One way to illustrate the question is say that there's this space, this subspace, that has to do with information processing and representation. And that's the bulk of what we study in neuroscience. And then there's this orthogonal question, which is, why is it that sometimes some of that information is subjectively experienced? So back to this question. What has philosophy of mind contributed to neuroscience? Well, there was this great idea, right, way back when, not to poo-poo Descartes, but we all kind of, I mean, there's a book called Descartes' Error, right? Consciousness is not in the pineal gland is not an antenna, right, that relays information from your consciousness to your brain and relays motor commands back. And like people who, for whatever reason, have had their pineal gland removed are just as conscious as the rest of us. But okay, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek. So is this, I mean, what has neuroscience contributed to philosophy in return? We just have a like sharper version of that same story, right? Because in the way we tell it, whether implicitly or usually implicitly, we end up falling back on the something else. And this view of an internal observer and the search for it, right, in the neural tissue. So what I want to do is just go through what, for me, are a few examples of contributions to neuroscience of consciousness from philosophy of mind, both the good and the bad. I'll say again, I regularly engage with philosophers, and I think that philosophy has a lot to offer neuroscience, but that doesn't mean that it always does, right? So the good things, I think the mind-body problem is something that the problem in the first place, or now renamed the hard problem, is something that was introduced and explained and articulated by philosophers, and scientists, then neuroscientists picked it up and ran with it. And it's been a hugely inspirational in terms of driving a lot of really good research. So good. Another thing, and this is a very short list, in the interest of time, but the biggest one for me is conceptual clarity. And that's something that philosophers, by and large, I don't know if they're necessarily better at it, but they're more willing to spend their time doing it. And that's really something that we need more of in, I'll speak for neuroscience. And then the bad, there's also the mind-body problem, once again, the hard problem. There are other ways in which the way the problem is formulated kind of leads us astray or away from what will actually maybe end up answering some questions. Because if we start thinking about consciousness as something else, at least from a scientific standpoint, we're already kind of out of business. And then another one of the bad things are conceptual distinctions that may be meaningful and useful for philosophers, but for whatever reason don't map onto anything, any distinction in the brain, right? And those can turn into kind of neuroscientific wild goose chases. So the good. The hard problem. There are lots of formulations of the hard problem. I like Leibniz mill. He just talks about, like, if you could walk into the brain as if it were a mill, that get really small and walk in there, and you'd see all kinds of gears and things moving around, but nothing by which to explain a perception. Schmid, right? Consciousness. And again, as if to suggest that there must be something else. Now, there is nothing else, right? And all of these very respected people have said the same. That's why there's a conundrum, right? Even Chalmers, who some say somehow leans toward being the philosopher, David Chalmers leans toward dualism, but in explaining the hard problem, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the part of the mystery is that it seems as if there must be something else, and yet there isn't when you look, right? You open up the brain, fish around in there, you won't find anything else. Neurons, glia, and stuff. So the hard problem. Then I think the other example I listed, where I think philosophers contributed something good and continue to do so, is conceptual clarity. And again, I think we need to do more of this. Here's an example of an experiment. I don't need to name names, but this is from Science Magazine in 2011. This was an experiment on attention and the relationship between attention and consciousness. And the upshot was that attention accounts for all of the change in the fMRI brain signal in visual cortex. And consciousness basically accounts for almost none. The data were so, the effect was so strong that they only had 4 subjects. 4 subjects. You given the size of their effect, you didn't need more. You didn't need more. But what they missed is that there are 2 kinds of attention, right? There's attention to a region of visual space. I can ask you, look at this little point, and without moving your eyes, shift your attention over to the right. That's visual spatial attention, right? There doesn't have to be any object there waiting for you. It can just be a gray background. No object necessary. You shift your attention in that way. If I look at the part of your visual cortex that's responsible for that region of your visual space, the signal goes up massively, even without an object there, right? But then there's another kind of attention, which is called object-based attention, right? That's when you actually direct your attention to an object that's somewhere in your visual space. And that's associated with a relatively weak little change in the bold signal, right? Well, given that consciousness is about objects, visual consciousness, right? If I ask you what you're conscious of, right? Even if it's something red, it's usually an object that's red, right? We don't normally talk about consciousness of a region of our visual space, right? Consciousness is about objects. And so if you were to do this experiment and you wanted to compare the effect of consciousness to the effect of attention, right? You'd want to compare it to object-based attention, right? But the sleight of hand, probably unwitting in this study, was to look at attention, talk about it in terms of object-based attention, but operationalize it in your experiment in terms of visual spatial attention. So now you get this huge effect in the brain signal. Almost nothing is attributed to consciousness, and you come up with a result that is essentially meaningless, right? I think it's just an example of not doing the conceptual analysis up front and taking account of, like, there are types, right? Another example is in research on states or disorders of consciousness. So we now have techniques that can read out your brain activity using EEG and can give a pretty good indicator of what state of consciousness you're in. This I'm referring to patients who've had a head injury, who are in a coma, or have come out of, usually if after a head injury, you present in a state that's called coma state, you stay in that for a few weeks, and then you transition into either a persistent vegetative state or a minimally conscious state, or you start to recover. And those 3 states plus the normal healthy awake state, right? These kind of classifiers can do a pretty good job of telling which category you're in. Now, we don't know what the ground truth is. So what the classifier is doing is giving you a very accurate idea of what the clinician would say, right? The question is, how much do inferences that we make based on the fact that these kind of techniques work? How much theory? I know it has clinical value, but how much theoretical value does it have, right? It's touted as having a lot of theoretical value, but I don't think it has any, because it's orthogonal to the question that we're interested in, right? This is just about whether or not you're online or offline, about whether or not you're receptive to information in the first place. But the real question is orthogonal to that. It's why, again, why is some information sometimes promoted to the status of being conscious and sometimes not, right? To kind of orient you a little bit better towards what I think the problem is that head injuries, brain damage, and things that will send you into a coma are not selective for subjective experience, not even close, right? You lose language ability, you can't follow commands, you can't juggle, I don't know, just use your imagination. There are a lot of things you can't do, right? So I could say, I'm going to study language ability by looking at coma patients, because when they're in a coma, they lose the ability to speak. It's essentially the same thing. All right, so that's conceptual clarity, and that's where I think neuroscience needs to do more work, and that's where I think we stand to get a lot, and have in the past gotten a lot of benefit from interactions with philosophers. The bad, well, again, the hard problem, and the fact that there really is nothing else, at least if you ask me. Where that's led us, right, was to about 30 years ago. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch suggested this workaround, right? There's this hard problem, and philosophers tell us that it's really hard, and we can't touch it. So as a workaround, let's just try to look at what kind of activity in the brain correlates with consciousness. Let's look for neural correlates with consciousness. And that's been sort of the theme of the field for the last 30 years. Well, what happens to theories that are born in that era of neural correlates, of searching for neural correlates, right? And in this era of the workaround, can you build a theory on that? What we end up having are theorists that introduce consciousness as something else, always start out with the hard problem, and then they operationally define it in terms of behavior experiments, which you kind of have to do. And then they don't address the hard problem by their own admission, a little bait and switch. And so I argue that these theories that are born from that they're not theories at all, right? They claim to be about the hard problem, and then they don't explain, right? They tell you what's correlated with consciousness. That's not an explanation in my mind. So bad thing number one. Bad thing number two are these distracting and useless conceptual distinctions that don't map onto any neural distinction, and probably never were. And my favorite is the distinction between what is called phenomenal and access consciousness. This is an idea that comes from philosopher Ned Block. Now Ned is a great thinker. He's a great guy. He's a powerhouse of a philosopher, but this is not one of his best ideas. Phenomenal versus access consciousness. So phenomenal consciousness is the subjective part, the raw feel, the qualia itself. To access is interactions with systems that support direct report, including reporting it to yourself or reflecting on it to yourself, to enable you to tell somebody what you're conscious of. So with this kind of a distinction, right, you could say, for example, to someone, oh, yeah, you're hearing voices right now, you just don't know it. Because you have the phenomenal consciousness, but not the access, right? That's sort of the nature, at least the strong interpretation. There's now a weaker interpretation of this distinction, but that I think doesn't give you any traction. Now, where this came from, among other places, were the experiments by Sperling in the 1960s, where he'd flash a grid like this on the screen, and then quiz you. This would be only on for like 50 milliseconds. He'd ask you, how much could you remember? And you could remember at most like 3 or 4 of the letters. Then he'd do a second version of the experiment where he'd flash up these letters for 50 milliseconds, have a blank screen for a little while, and then pop up a cue like this that would highlight one of the rows that used to be on the screen. And you could remember it, no problem. As if somewhere you had access to all 12 or all 9 or however many characters are on the screen, right? And this was where at least the idea for that distinction was born, right? Oh, well, you've got the phenomenal consciousness. You have qualia, subjective feel, I guess, but you just can't access it. And then when those cues appear, you can access it, right? It's a distinction that is a non-starter because you can never adjudicate, right? If there were such a difference, right? You'd never know it. How could you test? You'd have to ask. As soon as you ask, that's access. And then you can't do anything with this distinction. And yet for years and years and years, people have debated it, argued about it, written about it, done experiments about it. And I think it's a phenomenal, versus actually a phenomenal waste of time, mental resources, money, and ink. The biggest one I've ever encountered in my life as a scientist. So that's the bad. So my read on the ongoing relationship between philosophy and neuroscience and the study of consciousness, it's been too rare and infrequent, but there's been a lot of good that's come of it. And a prime example is one of my favorite papers of all time, Time and the Observer, the Where and When of Consciousness in the Brain, by Daniel Dennett, philosopher, and Marcel Kinsborn, so neurologist and neuroscientist. They took up a lot of topics in that paper, and one of the things they talk about is the color phi phenomenon, where you flash a dot in one location, and then you flash it in another location, and you don't perceive two separate dots. You perceive it as one dot that moved, that was displaced. And now if you actually flash like a red dot, and then the other dot you flash is a different color, like blue, you don't just perceive it as moving, but also as changing color in midstream, right? And that's really perplexing. And there are at least two different ways you could think of it, right? That you say something happened in memory, or something happened in perception, right? And the main point they were trying to make is that by citing these examples is that there is no place and time in the brain where it all comes together, right, for processing by consciousness. And famously, they're quoted as saying the fact of the matter, like about things like the color phi, for example, is that there is no fact of the matter, right? And at least in the way that people wanted there to be. And I think they gave us the idea of this picture, the Cartesian theater, so that scientists keep, without explicitly saying it, reverting back to this view of things, looking for the piece of brain that does the work. This has been a sort of guiding seminal paper for neuroscientists of consciousness for many years. This is a great example of a philosopher and a neuroscientist working together. Not the only example, but one of my favorites. But there are, so I've talked about this problem of us thinking of consciousness as something else, and in a sense wanting there to be something else so we can put an electrode in it. But there are other ways of conceiving of consciousness. One of them is as a perceptual attribution, something that we perceive to be there. Because face it, everything you know and think you know about the world around you and yourself comes through your perception, right? And maybe that includes consciousness itself. And then another one is as a behavioral dissociation, which is one where you can use to get more traction in research. So I'll talk about both of those briefly. So consciousness as a perceptual attribution the idea here is literally that it's something that we attribute to others and to ourselves in order to explain and predict behavior. And so here goes an example. This comes from Mike Graziano's book about consciousness and the social brain. There is a patient who's had brain damage, I think through a stroke. It's actually an anecdote, a real anecdote, who says to his neurologist, you know, I have a squirrel in my head. And so the neurologist, of course, says, oh, well, you know, sorry to hear that. I suppose you mean that you've got the idea of a squirrel in your head, like when you have a song in your head and you just can't get it out of your head, and you've got the idea of a squirrel in your head and you just can't stop thinking about it. The patient says, no, that's not it at all. I actually have like a furry little animal living inside my cranium. And so, you know, the neurologist is puzzled. He says, well, look at your brain scans. I mean, there's no furry animal in there. And plus that whole idea is just not consistent with anything we know about, you know, the laws of physics and biology and whatever. And the patient says, well, I know, but, and I know that's all true, but still, I swear to you, there's a squirrel in my head. So, I mean, okay, so clearly something about this patient's brain damage led to this very strange inference. So if you were working with the patient, right, you know, would you like go out and try to, like I did last night and for the last couple of weeks, prepare a grant proposal to start looking for the squirrel? Right? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't. But would you maybe write a grant proposal to try and figure out why the guy thinks he has a squirrel in his head? That's reasonable, right? That sounds like psychology to me. Now, so this is the idea of what we call it's a view of consciousness called illusionism. Illusionism isn't the best word, but for better or for worse, the idea that consciousness is itself a perceptual attribution. It doesn't have to be something else. It's something that we think is there, right? And that's all that matters, really, right? If I can account for why you say the things you say about consciousness, do I need to account for anything else? Even if you say it's something else, do I need to go looking for something else? That's the idea of illusionism. Well, okay, some have argued, well, that's like the meta problem. That's like, you know, assigning consciousness to others, attributing to them some sort of inner ghost. But that doesn't deal with the question of phenomenology, like that which I am experiencing subjectively right now. But I would say that it does, right? I mean, if you say that, is that just the same as blurting out, oh, but you haven't explained the squirrel? Well, not quite. But I think that phenomenology is de facto a conclusion that we arrive at. We arrive at the conclusion that this sensory perceptual information right here, right now is somehow special. Right? Something about this sensory perceptual information right here, right now defies explanation. I am not just processing sensory perceptual information right here and right now, there's something else. So I think that this idea of consciousness being an attribution can also apply to phenomenology, like in the moment. It's maybe harder to wrap your head around it, and it is because for basically every morning I have to wrap my head around it again. Because I like, wait, does that make sense? So okay, is consciousness just a shared delusion? I mean, that's a strong claim. Well, it's at least one that you should entertain, right? To just write it off and not consider it, I think would be a big mistake, right? I mean, and anyway, is it a shared delusion? Well, not quite. Not everyone shares it, right? I asked I tried to explain all of this to my grandmother. There's no heart problem. And also, it's not like the squirrel. It's about something real. The squirrel is just random, whatever, right? But consciousness is about something real that's happening, right? According to Graziano, it's a story that your brain tells about selective attention. right? But it's whatever it is, it's about something real that is measured, right? So back to this question of, is there anything meaningful to study? And if so, how should we define it? Well, one other way you can define it in a very theory neutral way is as a behavioral dissociation, a neural behavioral dissociation. There are certain things that can happen behaviorally and physiologically, even when you're not conscious of the stimulus. For example, you can have a change in skin conductance when you see, well, not when you see, but when you're presented visually with a spider, a picture of a spider that's masked so that you don't consciously see it and can't, right, above chance, discriminate it from something else. So you really can't see it, and yet it can change your skin conductance response. Okay, that's one piece of data, right? This is something that can happen without being conscious of a stimulus. Other things, for example, that you can't do are like chain together two math operations, like take the output of one math operation and use it as the input to another, right? So where are these lines to be drawn? The things that you can and cannot do with or without consciousness, right? If you think of it in those terms as a neural behavioral dissociation, there's a whole rich set of scientific questions out there waiting to be answered. And they're just as useful and interesting and important whether you're a dualist or an illusionist, right? One, I think, final point about what consciousness, what's necessary for consciousness, is the question of when. And it's a hard one to study, but it's really compelling. And I first came across this when I was working with the blind sight patient. What interested me was if you present stimuli on the screen that the patient can guess well about without claiming he sees nothing, you have to give him a cue to tell him when to guess. You have to give him like a little auditory beat that says, okay, now something just appeared on the screen. Can you guess what it was? If you just put stimuli on the screen and just wait for the patient to press buttons, he'll never press a button, right? And in fact, it's hard to imagine what it would mean for that to happen, for you to sit there and press a button when a certain stimulus appears and have no idea why, right? And that's very anecdotal, sort of off the cuff, but I think that's another fascinating question, and one of the things that maybe, right, requires consciousness, knowing when, right, detection in time, and that might relate to why the threshold of consciousness is where it is. So if you look at someone's psychophysical curve, this is their ability to discriminate a stimulus as a function of the signal strength, right? Where do you think the threshold is for consciousness? Well, it might be like all the way down, but just when it gets above 50%, when it gets above, you being able to, you being a chance, right? Okay, you're conscious of it, but it's not. If you do these experiments a lot, and I do them a lot, even when you're at 75% correct, you're not sure that you're really seeing anything. You're not sure at all of what you're seeing. So the threshold for conscious perception is high relative, somewhat high relative to the presence of information. There's a certain amount of information that consciousness decides to do without, right? That's below that threshold. And I think that points to consciousness as being a mechanism that's averse to false positives. And where does that matter, right? It matters in proactive decision making. So these kinds of behavioral questions can lead us to have interesting hypotheses about what consciousness is and what it's for. And what I'll close with is, I think, one way forward, whether you like the word or not, is to at least temporarily abandon the word consciousness, which is so loaded and ambiguous and we can just let Deepak Chopra keep it for a while, right? And we can talk, Danny Kahneman, I think, had it right when he talked just about system 1 and system 2, right? We can give it a different name later once we understand it, but it appears that there's this system that likes probabilities, this other one that likes certainty, right? This one that operates in a regime where false positives are relatively costly. The other one that entertains every possible interpretation all at once. These two systems, these are fascinating questions that are worthy of good science. So why not, right? Why not just forget the word for a while? And then as far as interactions with philosophers and what philosophy has to offer, what I think personally we should do is definitely interact. In neuroscience, we need philosophers, especially for getting conceptual clarity. And as part of that, the other thing we need to do is slow down. Everybody's in such, I mean, this is easier said than done, but we're in such a hurry to publish, and conceptual clarity takes a long time to get. And the other guy is going to publish fast if he just doesn't bother to think it through, does some rigorous science, and comes up with a flashy interpretation. And we've had flashy interpretations like that have lived on for 30, 40, 50 years and then been found to be absolutely wrong. So if there's a way to give credit for doing good science, not just a lot of it, we should look into that. One idea is to take the H factor and divide it by your total number of publications. What if you have a high H factor, but in order to get it, you generated thousands of publications that were never cited, right? So there are ways of incentivizing doing, in a sense, less, but better. And that's something I think we can do together more productively with philosophers in neuroscience. And